The wind blew with almost supernatural force that night, howling through the desolate fields and shaking the branches of the dry trees that lined the empty road. The rain fell in torrents, creating an incessant pounding sound on the asphalt that echoed in the vastness of nothingness. Lighting was scarce, limited to a few dim bulbs from old streetlights scattered irregularly along the highway. The road seemed endless, a lonely path that led nowhere, until a lonely, shadowy figure emerged from the shadows, the Bates Motel. Located on the side of the road, the motel had an air of abandonment and decay that made your heart beat faster just by looking at it. Neon signs that once might have glowed with promises of comfort now flickered sporadically, as if fighting the inevitable darkness. The main building, a two-story structure with peeling paint and dusty windows, welcomed weary travelers venturing into these forgotten parts. Above the motel, on a hill that seemed to oversee everything with an almost omnipotent presence, stood the Bates house, an imposing but visibly decaying mansion that dominated the landscape with its ominous silhouette against the night sky. Norman Bates, the caretaker of this forgotten corner, was a man with an ordinary, almost harmless appearance. He was slender, with dark hair and eyes that sparkled with an intensity that, in another situation, might have been mistaken for gentleness. His clothes were simple and conservative, reinforcing the image of a solitary and somewhat old-fashioned man. Norman conducted his activities with meticulous precision, from welcoming guests to maintaining rooms, always with a courtesy that seemed strangely forced. There was something disturbingly polite about the way he spoke and acted, a disconcerting contrast to the decadent environment around him. Norman lived alone, or at least that's what he allowed others to think. The large house above the motel, with its perpetually closed windows and creaking doors, held secrets he shared with no one. The lights in the house often flickered, suggesting the presence of someone or something inside. It was known by the few residents of the region that Norman had an extremely close relationship with his mother, a woman no one had seen for a long time, but whose presence was still strongly felt. One rainy night, a young traveler lost and desperate for a place to shelter, headed to the Bates Motel. The darkness and storm intensified the feeling of isolation, and the motel, despite its gloomy appearance, seemed like a refuge from nature's fury. Upon entering the lobby, she was greeted by Norman, whose courteous smile and polite manner could not fully mask the discomfort he radiated. The charged atmosphere and the almost palpable stillness of the place seemed to hold time in an unsettling suspension. Norman offered the traveler a room, guiding her through the dimly lit hallway while the storm outside raged with an almost animal fury. Leaving her in her room, he assured her that she would be available for any needs, before disappearing back into the darkness of the hallway. The young woman, still nervous and suspicious, looked around the modest room, trying to ignore the oppressive feeling the place emanated. Little did she know that that night would be just the beginning of an unimaginable nightmare, where the macabre secrets of Norman Bates and his hilltop home would be revealed in all their monstrous glory. The wind continued to howl, as if it wanted to warn her of impending danger, but the surface calm of the Bates Motel was like the calm before the storm, about to explode into a symphony of terror and despair. The young traveler, now settled in her room at the Bates Motel, began to strip away the tension of the road. The room was modest, with old furniture and a faint musty odor, but it was a welcome shelter from the storm. The thin walls allowed the distant sound of rain to shine through, mixed with the occasional creaking of the house's wooden beams. Still, something in the environment kept her senses alert, a restlessness she couldn't ignore. After settling in, the young woman decided to go down to reception to thank Norman for his hospitality. As she approached the lobby, she found Norman sitting behind the counter, meticulously arranging keys and checking records. He looked up when he saw her, and a shy and somewhat disconcerting smile curved her lips. Her eyes, however, had a disturbing depth, as if they hid unfathomable secrets. Norman greeted her with impeccable politeness, his voice soft and gentle. There was something in her behavior that suggested extreme, almost pathological shyness. He was attentive, perhaps overly so, to her needs, offering tea and trying to start a light conversation about her trip and the stormy weather. Yet his every move seemed calculated, almost rehearsed, as if he were playing a role she knew well. As they talked, the young woman noticed that Norman frequently mentioned her mother, always in reverent and almost idolizing tones. He spoke of her fragile health, how she preferred to remain secluded in the big house, and how he devoted himself to taking care of her with absolute devotion. Every mention of her mother was accompanied by a peculiar gleam in her eyes, a mixture of pride and something darker, something she couldn't quite define. As he spoke, the young woman couldn't help but notice the decorations in the lobby. There were old black and white photos, depicting a stern woman who she assumed was Norman's mother. The frames were old and well polished, as if they were objects of veneration. There were also old-fashioned objects that didn't fit in with the modern era, suggesting that the place was a time capsule, immune to changes in the outside world. The conversation was interrupted by a noise coming from the big house. Norman immediately tensed, his eyes instinctively going towards the sound. He hurriedly excused himself and left, muttering something about checking to see if his mother needed anything. The young woman was left alone in the lobby, the feeling of discomfort growing as silence settled in again. The mystery surrounding Norman Bates and his mother was palpable, an almost tangible presence that permeated the air. Alone, she looked around once more, trying to understand the feeling of oppression that hung over the place. Something about that motel wasn't right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. She decided to return to her room, feeling a cold that didn't just come from the storm outside. As she walked down the hallway, the dim light from the lamp seemed to create moving shadows on the walls, intensifying the feeling that she was being watched. Norman's behavior, his obvious obsession with his mother, and the atmosphere of mystery that permeated the motel began to create a growing sense of dread. Every detail seemed to conspire to fuel a silent anxiety, an expectation that something terrible was lurking. As she closed the door to her room, the young woman could not imagine that Norman's disconcerting courtesy was only the surface of an abyss of horror waiting to be revealed. The storm outside was roaring with increasing intensity, thunder rumbling like an ominous warning in the hills surrounding the Bates Motel. In the midst of this fierce storm, a young traveler, drenched and exhausted, battled the elements as she searched for a safe place to take shelter. Her car, a sedan worn out by time and roads, creaked and groaned as it was forced to continue on the journey. The windshield wipers struggled in vain to maintain visibility, and the young woman, with her hands shaking and her heart racing, finally saw the flashing light of the Bates Motel sign through the curtain of rain. Cautiously heading towards the motel entrance, she hurriedly parked the car and almost tripped as she got out, running towards reception to escape the pouring rain. Upon entering, she was greeted by the oppressive silence of the dimly lit lobby. Drops of water ran from their clothes and hair, forming small puddles on the worn wooden floor. She breathed hard, relieved to finally find refuge, although the place itself emanated an unsettling atmosphere. Norman Bates appeared behind the counter, as if he had emerged from the shadows. He smiled at the young woman, a smile that seemed genuine, but there was something disconcerting about its intensity. Her eyes quickly scanned her, assessing her condition before offering to help. His voice was soft and courteous, offering her a room for the night and insisting that she dry off and rest. The young woman thanked him, noticing the almost obsessive way in which Norman dedicated himself to ensuring her comfort. He brought a towel and offered a hot drink, all the while maintaining that polite but slightly unsettling expression. He asked about her trip, and she, still shaking from the experience, began to tell him about how she had gotten lost in the storm, looking for an alternative route to reach her final destination. Norman listened intently, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel uncomfortable, though he didn't know exactly why. As she spoke, Norman casually mentioned his mother, explaining that she was sleeping in the big house and that it was best not to make too much noise so as not to disturb her. The young woman nodded, feeling a mixture of curiosity and apprehension about this invisible mother who seemed to silently rule the place. There was an almost religious reverence in the way Norman spoke of her, which only added to the mystery surrounding the matriarchal figure no one saw. After arranging accommodation, Norman guided the young woman to her room, a brief walk, but one filled with indefinable tension. The hallway seemed to go on longer than it should, shadows dancing on the walls as the dim light from the lamps flickered. When they reached the room, Norman opened the door with an old key, allowing her to enter. He wished her a good night, assuring her that she would be available for any needs. Alone in the room, the young woman finally began to relax, although the feeling of restlessness did not leave her completely. The room, with its old-fashioned decor and worn furniture, was a reflection of the motel itself, a place trapped in time, haunted by memories and secrets she didn't yet understand. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sound of rain hammering the roof, and allowed herself a sigh of relief. However, the figure of Norman and the constant references to her mother never left her mind. As she prepared for bed, she couldn't help but think about Norman's words and the strange feeling he gave off. There was something deeply wrong in that place, something that the young woman couldn't define, but that clung to her like a shadow. She decided that in the morning she would continue her journey as early as possible, leaving the Bates Motel and its disturbing mysteries behind. The young traveler, after settling into her room, decided that a little conversation could help dispel the strange feeling of discomfort that still haunted her. So she went back down to the lobby, where she found Norman arranging some keys and checking records. Upon seeing her, he smiled with the same disturbing politeness and offered her a seat in the small sitting room next to the reception desk. Norman brought the young woman a cup of hot tea, and they began to make small talk. He asked about her trip, and she responded with details about the journey, the difficulties of the storm and the feeling of relief upon finding the motel. Norman listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face, as if every word was of utmost importance to him. The young woman felt a strange mixture of comfort and discomfort under Norman's intense gaze, as if he were trying to read her. As the conversation progressed, Norman began to talk more about the motel itself and its history. He mentioned that the place had been built by his father, but that, after his death, he and his mother had taken over the administration. When talking about his mother, his tone changed noticeably, becoming more reverent and filled with an almost fanatical devotion. He described his mother as a strong woman, but in fragile health, who preferred the solitude of the big house. Every time he mentioned his mother, a strange gleam appeared in her eyes, a mixture of love and something darker, something the young woman couldn't identify. The young woman, trying to keep the conversation light, asked about Norman's hobbies. He spoke about his taxidermy collection, enthusiastically describing the process of preserving animals and the patience required for the meticulous work. His voice gained an unexpected animation when talking about the subject, but there was a disturbing detail in his words, as if the act of taxidermy was more than a simple hobby for him. The young woman feigned interest, but a feeling of discomfort grew within her with each word. Norman, noticing the slight tension in the young woman, tried to reassure her with stories about the calm and beauty of the place during the day, when the sun illuminated the fields around the motel. He mentioned how he enjoyed watching birds and nature, but even these stories had a melancholic, almost funereal tone. It was as if he was trying to convince her, and perhaps himself, that there was something good in this dark place. The conversation was interrupted again by a noise coming from the big house. Norman visibly tensed, his smile fading as his eyes turned to the source of the sound. He hurriedly apologized, muttering that he needed to see if his mother was okay, and left, leaving the young girl alone in the living room. She watched as he disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, feeling a wave of relief mixed with a growing curiosity. Alone again, the young woman reflected on the interaction. There was something deeply disturbing about Norman Bates, something that went beyond his shyness and his obsession with his mother. Their seemingly friendly demeanors were filled with sinister subtexts, and every word carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The motel, with its oppressive atmosphere and unrevealed secrets, seemed a perfect stage for the horrors her imagination was beginning to conjure. Determined not to let her mind be dominated by fear, the young woman decided to return to her room, hoping that sleep would bring her some rest. As she climbed the stairs, the sound of rain continued to hammer the roof, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move with a life of their own. The interaction with Norman had planted a seed of uneasiness in her mind, and she knew that the secrets of the Bates Motel and its strange owner were still far from being fully revealed. The young traveler, lying on the bed in her room, tried to shake off the disturbing thoughts that had haunted her since her arrival at the Bates Motel. But curiosity and the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't leave her alone. Deciding to better understand the place she was in, she silently got up, put on a coat and left the room, making sure not to make any noise. The motel hallway was dim, with only the dim light of a few old lamps casting long shadows on the walls. Each step seemed to echo in the oppressive silence. She walked toward the reception desk, where the soft light from a desk lamp partially illuminated the lobby. Norman was nowhere to be seen, probably still in the big house with his mother. The young woman decided to start her exploration at the motel itself. She walked down the halls, peering into the unoccupied rooms. Each room was a variation on the same decadent theme: old, worn furniture, faded wallpaper, and a faint musty smell. But there was something else that captured her attention: small evidence of a female presence. In one of the rooms, she found an old hairbrush with long, gray hairs stuck in the bristles. In another, a hand mirror decorated with floral motifs, as if a woman had passed by and left behind small fragments of her life. The feeling of restlessness grew as she explored more. In a closet, she found old dresses, carefully hung and covered in a fine layer of dust. These details reinforced the presence of Norman's mother, a presence that seemed to extend throughout the motel, dominating the space with silent authority. The young girl couldn't escape the feeling that Norman's mother was everywhere, like a ghost who refused to rest. With her curiosity now transformed into an almost desperate need to understand, she headed towards the big house. The front door was just ajar, allowing him to enter without difficulty. The inside of the house was even more oppressive than the motel. The decor was old-fashioned and gloomy, with heavy dark wood furniture and thick curtains that kept the light out. The air was charged, as if time had stopped there. She climbed the stairs carefully, each step creaking under her weight. Upon reaching the upper floor, the young woman found a corridor with several closed doors. She decided to start with the master bedroom, the door of which was slightly open. Upon pushing it, she found a room that looked like a sanctuary. The large bed was perfectly made, covered with an antique lace bedspread. On the bedside tables were framed photos of a stern woman, Norman's mother, presumably, staring into the camera with a stern look. The young woman approached a large wardrobe and opened its doors. Inside, more dresses, all carefully organized by color and style, as if waiting for someone who would never return. She ran her fingers through the fabrics, feeling the coldness of the ancient materials and the unsettling presence of the woman they belonged to. Deciding to continue, the young woman explored other parts of the house. In a living room, she found a worn armchair next to a coffee table lined with cookbooks and old magazines, as if someone had spent hours there, reading and reflecting. Everything in the house seemed to scream the presence of a woman who dominated the environment even in her physical absence. Her exploration led her to a small office, where she found more disturbing evidence. There were letters and notes written in a firm, decisive hand, many of them addressed to Norman. The words expressed an implacable authority, an absolute control over every aspect of his life. The young woman felt a chill when she read those words, realizing how oppressive and dominant the figure of Norman's mother was. Finally, she arrived at a locked room. She tried to turn the handle, but it was firmly closed. Something about that locked door filled her with a sense of dread, as if the house's darkest secret was hidden there. She decided not to force entry, at least for now, and retreated into the hallway. As I walked downstairs, the silence in the house seemed more oppressive than ever. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound was amplified, creating an atmosphere of growing terror. The young woman knew there were more secrets to be discovered, but the initial exploration had already revealed enough to confirm her suspicions. The house and motel were dominated by the presence of a woman who, although absent, still maintained frightening control over Norman and the surrounding environment. After returning to her motel room, the young woman lay down on the bed, but sleep seemed impossible. Exploring the house had left his mind racing, full of questions and uncertainties. The constant sound of rain on the roof now sounded like an ominous whisper, as if the environment itself was trying to tell him its secrets. Determined to find out more, she remained alert, waiting for any sign that might provide more clues about Norman Bates and his mysterious mother. Dawn advanced slowly, and it was then that the young woman heard voices coming from the big house. She stood up silently and peered out the window, managing to see lights on upstairs. The voices were muffled by distance and rain, but there was enough clarity to distinguish that a heated argument was in progress. Norman's voice, although usually soft and polite, was now raised and full of frustration. The other voice, sharper and more authoritative, could only be his mother's. The young woman's curiosity was irresistible. Barefoot, she left the room and walked down the dark motel hallway to the front door. She stepped out into the rain, which had now eased to a steady drizzle, and approached the big house silently. The light upstairs shone brightly, casting dark shadows on the windows. She found a strategic point where she could hear better without being seen. The argument between Norman and his mother was intense. Norman's voice was full of desperation, almost pleading, while his mother's voice was sharp and domineering. "Why can't you leave me alone for once, Mom?" Norman screamed, his voice broken with grief. "Because you are weak, Norman. Always has been and always will be. You need me, you don't know how to live without me." Norman's mother's voice echoed with cold authority, each word a blow to Norman's fragile psyche. The young woman felt a shiver run down her spine. The intensity of the argument revealed a lot about the toxic dynamic between mother and son. She could feel the weight of Norman's mother's absolute control over him, crushing any vestiges of independence or willpower he might have had. The tension between them was almost palpable, as if it were embedded in the walls of the house. Time seemed to drag by as the discussion continued. The young woman could hear Norman alternating between pleas and furious responses, a desperate struggle to assert some control over his own life. But the mother always had the final word, her voice filled with contempt and power. The young woman could not understand why Norman, a grown man, allowed himself to be treated in this way. His mother's influence was so strong that he seemed unable to free himself. Suddenly, the discussion abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was even more oppressive, leaving the young girl with a feeling of anticipation and fear. What had caused the sudden interruption? She waited, her ears straining for any sign, but all she heard was the dripping of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. The light upstairs remained on, but the voices did not return. Deciding not to expose herself any further, the young woman returned to the motel, her clothes soaked and her nerves on edge. Upon entering the room, she locked the door and lay down on the bed, trying to process everything she had heard. The tension of the argument, the toxic dynamic between Norman and his mother, and the lingering feeling that there was so much more hidden in that place made any attempt at rest impossible. She knew she was getting involved in something dangerous, but curiosity was stronger than fear. Every detail, every scrap of information only increased his desire to understand what was really going on at the Bates Motel and the big house. The figure of her mother, although never seen, was becoming a terrifying presence in her mind, a shadow that dominated everything around her. The young woman decided that the next day, she would try to find a way to find out more. She might confront Norman directly or explore the house more carefully, but one thing was certain. She couldn't leave this place without getting answers. The night was slowly advancing, and she knew that the secrets of the Bates Motel were still far from being completely revealed. The next morning brought a pale, filtered light through the heavy rain clouds, but for the young woman, the relief of a new day was insufficient to dispel the feeling of oppression that the previous night had left behind. Determined to uncover the secrets of the Bates Motel, she decided she needed to enter the big house again, this time with more courage and determination. She knew she was taking a risk, but her curiosity and need to understand the truth were stronger than her fear. She waited until Norman was busy with his morning chores at the motel. Seeing her opportunity, she discreetly left her room and headed towards the big house. The front door was propped open again, as if inviting her to enter. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, the heavy, damp air inside immediately enveloping her. Moving cautiously, the young woman climbed the stairs, aware of every creak of the boards beneath her feet. She reached the upstairs hallway and headed straight for her mother's room, which she had partially explored the night before. This time, she walked in with more confidence, ready to find answers. The room was immaculate, as if prepared for an inspection. The dresses still hanging in the closet, the bed perfectly made, and the personal objects arranged with an almost obsessive precision. However, the true horror was still hidden. The young woman began to look for signs of something more, something that would explain the ghostly presence she felt in every corner of the house. It was then that she found a small door, almost hidden behind a heavy cabinet. The door was locked, but it didn't seem like an insurmountable obstacle. After quickly searching around, she found an old key in a nearby drawer. With a tremor in her hands, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led to an attic. Climbing the stairs cautiously, the young woman felt her heart racing with each step. The darkness of the attic was pervasive, but a small window allowed a dim light to illuminate the space. When her eyes adjusted, she saw something that made her gasp in horror. In the center of the attic, in a rocking chair, was the body of Norman's mother. But it wasn't just any body. It was grotesquely preserved, the skin dried out and stretched over the bones, the eyes sunk into empty sockets that seemed to observe everything. Dressed in one of her old dresses, the figure looked like a macabre parody of life. The chair rocked slightly, as if a ghostly movement were animating it. The young woman felt her legs weaken, terror taking over her body. She tried to step back, but her eyes were glued to the horrifying sight before her. The scene was a living nightmare, and the reality of what Norman had done to preserve his mother was even more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. Behind the chair, on a shelf, were jars and preservation instruments, evidence that Norman had taken time and meticulous care to keep his mother alive in some grotesque way. She began to realize that her mother's dominant presence in the house and motel was more literal than symbolic. Norman's mother was not just an authoritative figure in life, even in death, she exercised complete control over him. Desperate to get out of that hellish place, the young woman turned around and ran towards the stairs, her heart beating wildly. She almost stumbled down the steps and left the room, her thoughts a whirlwind of horror and confusion. She ran down the hallway, feeling as if the walls were closing in around her, and went down the stairs of the big house, determined to escape this nightmare. Upon reaching the ground floor, she stopped for a moment to catch her breath. She needed to think of a plan, she needed to leave the motel and call the police. But in the back of her mind, she knew Norman wouldn't let her go that easily. The macabre revelation had put her life in danger, and she needed to act quickly. With one last look at the big house, the young woman ran back to the motel, her mind still haunted by the sight of the preserved body. She knew that time was against her and that she needed to get out of that place before it was too late. The horror of her discovery drove her, and the will to survive was stronger than any fear she could feel. The young woman, with her heart racing, ran back to her motel room. He locked the door and leaned against it, trying to catch his breath and process the horrible discovery. She knew she needed to get out of there as quickly as possible, but something stopped her. It was as if a part of her knew that if she ran now, Norman could continue his horrors with impunity. She needed to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. She decided the only way to end this nightmare was to confront Norman directly. She mustered up all the courage she could and left her room, walking down the hall to reception. When she arrived, she saw Norman behind the counter, his demeanor calm and collected as always. But now, knowing what she knew, she could see the madness in his eyes, a spark that had previously gone unnoticed. "Norman," she called, trying to keep her voice steady, "we need to talk." Norman looked at her, a polite smile appearing on her face. "Of course, what would you like to know?" The young woman hesitated for a moment, but knew there was no turning back. "About your mother," she said, watching his reaction. "I know what you did." Norman's smile disappeared, and his eyes darkened. He was silent for a moment, as if processing the meaning of her words. Then, slowly, he stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward her, each step measured and threatening. "You don't know anything," he said, his voice low and carrying a silent threat. "My mom is fine. She's resting." "No, Norman," the young woman insisted, taking a step back. "I saw her. I saw what you did to her. She's dead, and you preserved her." Norman stopped, his face contorting in a mixture of anger and pain. "You don't understand," he whispered, almost to himself. "She never left me. She's always here with me." The young woman felt a shiver run down her spine. "Norman, you need help. This isn't normal. You need to leave this behind." Suddenly, Norman's expression changed, as if a shadow had passed over his face. His eyes went blank and his posture became rigid. "Norman isn't here right now," he said, his voice taking on a higher, more authoritative tone. "It's me, his mother. And you have no right to talk about us like that." The young woman took another step back, feeling terror growing inside her. The change in Norman's voice, his posture, everything indicated that he truly believed he was her mother. She realized that she was dealing with something much more dangerous than she had imagined. "Please," she tried again, her voice shaking, "you need to understand that this isn't real. Norman, you need to face the truth." Norman, or rather the mother persona within him, charged forward with seething anger. "You don't understand anything. I protect my son. He's weak without me." The young woman knew she had to do something, but she was caught between the desire to help Norman and the need to protect herself. "Norman, I know you're there. You can fight this. You can be free." For a brief moment, Norman's eyes seemed to clear, a glimpse of the man trapped inside the madness. But then, the mother's shadow returned, stronger and more aggressive. "Get out of here," her voice ordered, cold and implacable. "Or you'll regret it." The young woman, seeing that the situation was becoming dangerous, decided that she needed to flee. But before she could take another step, Norman advanced on her, his expression a mix of despair and fury. The confrontation was inevitable. She struggled against him, trying to free herself from his grip. Norman, driven by a strength that seemed beyond his own, managed to hold her down with one hand while trying to silence her with the other. "Norman, please," she managed, her voice choked. "You do not have to do this." There was a moment of hesitation, a split second where she saw the real Norman struggling to emerge. But the mother persona was determined to maintain control. "He can't live without me," the voice said, with terrifying conviction. Desperate, the young woman used all her strength to free herself, finally managing to free herself and run towards the door. Norman tried to follow her, but his inner turmoil gave him the advantage he needed to escape. She ran down the motel hallway, knowing that every second counted. She needed to get out of there, find help, and go back to save Norman from himself. The battle within him was clear, and she knew he couldn't win it alone. As she ran through the rain toward her car, she heard Norman's distant screams, mixed with her mother's commanding voice. She knew this confrontation was just the beginning of something much darker, but she was determined not to let the terror of the Bates Motel be perpetuated. The young woman ran out of the motel, the cold, damp night air enveloping her as she struggled to get to her car. Each step felt like an eternity, her fear gripping his chest like an icy hand. Behind her, she could hear Norman's furious screams, his voice mixing with that of his mother's persona, creating a terrifying cacophony that echoed in the darkness. She reached her car and, with shaking hands, searched her pocket for her keys. Finding them, she unlocked the door and entered, immediately locking herself. Panic gripped her, but she knew she needed to focus. She put the key in the ignition and tried to start the engine, but it failed, making a dry, distressing noise. Come on," she muttered to herself, turning the key again. This time, the engine roared, but before she could accelerate, she saw Norman's figure approaching quickly in the rearview mirror. He was completely out of it, his eyes wild and his expression contorted with hatred and despair. He reached the car and began banging on the window loudly, shouting incoherent words. The young woman couldn't wait any longer. She stepped on the accelerator, making the car move forward sharply. Norman tried to hold the door, but was dragged a few meters before falling to the ground, rolling through the mud. Without looking back, she drove at high speed down the winding path that led to the main road, her heart beating so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. But the escape was far from easy. The road was slippery from the incessant rain, and the car's headlights barely illuminated the path ahead. Every turn seemed like a potential trap, and she knew that a skid could be fatal. She focused on driving carefully, trying to stay calm as the distance between her and the motel grew. For a moment, she thought she had escaped. But in her rearview mirror, she saw a pair of headlights approaching quickly. It was Norman, driving an old motel car, his speed threatening and his determination clear. He wouldn't let her get away so easily. Terror came back to dominate her thoughts as she tried to speed up, but Norman's old car was getting closer and closer. Desperate, the young woman began to maneuver the car, trying to prevent Norman from reaching her. He began hitting her back bumper, trying to force her off the road. Each impact sent the car sliding, and she struggled to maintain control. The narrow, winding road seemed to conspire against her, each turn a new threat. Finally, a particularly tight corner forced both cars to slow down. Norman took the opportunity to hit her harder, causing the young woman's car to skid violently off the road. The car slid through the mud and stopped abruptly after colliding with a tree. The impact was brutal, and the young woman was stunned, the world spinning around her. She tried to move, but the pain immobilized her for a moment. She saw Norman get out of the car and slowly approach, his face a mask of madness and hatred. With a tremendous effort, she managed to undo her seat belt and open the car door. She tried to get out, but her legs were weak, her vision blurred. Norman reached her, grabbing her tightly. "You're not going anywhere," he murmured, voice mixing with that of his mother's persona. "You can't run away." The young woman fought against him, using all her remaining strength. The fight was desperate and brutal, both men falling into the mud as they tried to gain the upper hand. Norman was stronger, but her mind was divided, madness weakening her resolve. She managed to land a blow on his face, making him stagger back. Seizing the moment, she got up and ran in the opposite direction, her steps unsteady and clumsy. She felt the searing pain in her body, but the will to survive was stronger. She knew she couldn't get back to the car, that she needed to find help before Norman caught up with her again. She looked around desperately, looking for an escape route. The main road was still far away, but in the distance, she saw the lights of an isolated house. It was her only chance. She gathered up all her courage and started running towards the lights, hoping someone inside could help her. She could hear Norman getting up behind her, the heavy, angry footsteps approaching again. Time seemed to drag by as she ran, each step a battle against exhaustion and fear. The lights in the house were getting closer, and with them, the hope of escaping that nightmare. She felt a new surge of adrenaline and sped up, praying she could make it in time. The young woman ran with all her strength towards the lights of the isolated house, the sound of her own footsteps mixing with those of Norman, who was getting closer and closer. Her breathing was labored, the cold night air burning her lungs as she struggled to keep the distance between them. Fear and adrenaline drove her, but she knew she couldn't go on like this for long. She looked over her shoulder and saw Norman, his expression a mixture of despair and fury, madness taking over her eyes. He moved forward with terrifying determination, and she knew she needed to find a way to stop him, at least temporarily, to buy time and get to the house. As she approached the house, she noticed a tool shed to the left. Without thinking, she diverted her route and ran into the warehouse, her footsteps echoing in the cramped space. She frantically searched for something she could use as a weapon. Her hands shook as she searched shelves and boxes, until she found an old crowbar. She gripped it tightly, feeling its cold, metallic weight in her palm. The sound of Norman's footsteps approached the warehouse. She knew she only had a moment to act. She positioned herself next to the entrance, crowbar raised, ready to defend herself. Her heart beat wildly as she waited, every second feeling like an eternity. Norman entered the warehouse, his eyes scanning the darkness. "I know you're here," he said, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "There's no point in running." She waited until he was close enough. With all the strength she had, she swung the crowbar, hitting him in the side of the head. Norman staggered, a cry of pain and surprise escaping his lips. He fell to the ground, his hand holding his bloody head. Without wasting time, the young woman ran out of the shed, towards the house. She could hear Norman getting up behind her, his steps shaky and frantic. The pain seemed to have weakened her pursuit, but she knew he wouldn't give up easily. The distance between her and the house was decreasing, the lights now brighter and more comforting. She reached the front door and knocked loudly, screaming for help. "Please, someone help me. It's coming for me." There was a moment of agonizing silence before the door opened. A middle-aged man appeared, his eyes wide with surprise and concern. "What is happening?" he asked, looking over her shoulder. "Please let me in," she begged, breathless. "There's a man behind me, he's crazy." The man looked at the road, seeing Norman's approaching figure, and pulled the young woman inside, locking the door behind her. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a rifle from a nearby shelf. "I'll handle it." The young woman cowered behind the man, fear still squeezing her chest. Norman arrived at the door, banging on it furiously. "Get out of here. She's mine." The man pointed the rifle at the door, his expression resolute. "Go away, or I'll shoot." Norman hesitated for a moment, anger and madness fighting against a survival instinct. He took another step, and the man fired a warning shot, the loud sound echoing through the night. Norman backed away, anger turning to frustration. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I need her." Seeing that the situation was out of control, Norman turned around and ran back to the motel, his figure disappearing into the darkness. The young woman collapsed to the floor, relief and exhaustion finally taking over. She knew that, at least for now, she was safe. The man turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you well?" She nodded, still trying to catch her breath. "Thank you. I need to call the police." He won't stop. The man helped her up and led her to a telephone. "Let's call right now. You're safe here." As the young woman dialed the police number, she felt a rush of gratitude and hope. She knew there was still much to be done, but at least she had escaped the immediate horror. And with the help of the man and the police, she could finally stand up to Norman and make sure he didn't hurt anyone else. The young woman trembled as she dialed the police number, her fingers still trembling from the adrenaline of escaping. The man who helped her remained beside her, his gaze concerned as she quickly explained the situation to the operator on the other end of the line. She called for immediate reinforcements, describing the danger Norman posed. As they waited, the tension in the air was palpable. The house was silent except for the distant sound of rain hitting the windows. The man brought a blanket for the young woman, which was wet and soaked with mud. He tried to comfort her as they waited for the sound of police sirens. It wasn't long before blue and red lights flashed through the house's windows. The young woman breathed a sigh of relief when she saw the police cars approaching. They entered the property cautiously, armed and ready for anything. The young woman left the house, still feeling the pain and fatigue of escaping, but grateful to be safe. The officers spoke briefly with her, asking about the incident and asking for details about Norman. She explained everything she knew, from her arrival at the motel to the fight in the warehouse. The police officers seemed serious and determined to capture Norman. Meanwhile, more sirens approached. It was the emergency medical unit, called to check the young woman's condition and provide any necessary assistance. She was quickly examined, and despite the bruises and bruises, she was relieved to have no serious injuries. Officers began canvassing the area, looking for any sign of Norman. They entered the motel cautiously, armed and prepared for the worst. The young woman watched from the entrance of the house, her heart still racing. She knew Norman was dangerous and unpredictable, and just hoped he was captured before he could hurt anyone else. Minutes dragged on like hours, until finally they heard a distant scream. The officers emerged from the motel, holding Norman tightly, his wrists cuffed behind his back. He fought and resisted, but there was no escaping justice now. The young woman felt a mix of relief and sadness when she saw him being taken away by the police. She knew he needed help, psychiatric treatment, but she also knew she could no longer allow him to continue to spread the terror she experienced. As officers led him away from the property, she approached the man who helped her, deeply thanking him for his courage and support. He smiled gently, saying he did what anyone would do in a similar situation. The young woman looked back one last time, seeing Norman being placed in the police car. She knew that night would change her life forever, but she was grateful to have survived the nightmare of the Bates Motel. The days that followed were intense investigations at the Bates Motel. The police discovered horrors that surpassed the understanding of the young woman and the investigators. In Norman Bates' chambers, they found macabre trophies made of human bones and skin, grotesque reminders of his victims. Each discovery heightened the horrific reality of what had really happened beneath the decaying roof of the isolated motel. Local and national newspapers were soon running headlines about Norman's crimes, echoing the dark events that had unfolded at the Bates Motel. The impact on the community was profound, leaving everyone perplexed by the ability of evil to hide for so long in a seemingly ordinary place. For the protagonist, the experience was a painful awakening about the hidden dangers that can exist in seemingly safe places. She reflected on the nature of evil and how it can manifest itself, often disguised by facades of normality. Toxic relationships, like Norman's with his mother, were a grim reminder of the damage they can do and the devastating consequences they can have. While recovering from her physical and emotional injuries, the young woman found support in family, friends, and therapy, seeking to understand and overcome the traumas she had faced. The Bates Motel would remain a grim symbol in her memory, a constant reminder of the night that changed her life forever. The psychological impact on the protagonist was profound and lasting. After the traumatic encounter with Norman Bates, she struggled to deal with the horrors she witnessed and the emotional scars that were left behind. Frequent nightmares haunted her nights, reliving the scary moments at the Bates Motel. Every shadow and every sudden noise brought back distressing memories. Seeking professional help, the protagonist began therapy to face the trauma. The sessions were painful, but essential to begin rebuilding your life. The therapist helped her understand the complexities of psychological trauma and develop mechanisms to deal with the fear and anxiety that were now part of her daily life. In addition to therapy, support from family and friends was fundamental. They were there to listen, support, and offer comfort during difficult times. Each step toward recovery was a challenge, but also a sign of her resilience and determination to move forward. The protagonist found solace in art and writing, using these forms of expression as a way to process her emotions and experiences. Writing about what happened at the Bates Motel became a form of therapy in itself, helping her make sense of the chaos she had experienced. Gradually, she began to rebuild her life, one step at a time. She took up hobbies she had abandoned, found comfort in the daily routine, and slowly began to feel a sense of normalcy returning. The scar from the trauma was still present, but she learned to live with it, transforming it into a driving force for her personal growth. The Bates Motel would remain a dark chapter in her life, but also a powerful reminder of her courage and survival. She was determined not to let the past define her future, choosing each day to face her fears and move forward with hope and resilience. Reflecting on Norman Bates, the protagonist found herself confronting the complexity of the disturbed mind that inhabited the Bates Motel. Norman emerged as a vivid portrait of loneliness and the devastating influence of dysfunctional family relationships. Her solitary life, dominated by her mother, combined with her emotional and psychological fragility, created fertile ground for the tragedy to unfold. While exploring Norman's quarters and the decaying house above the motel, the protagonist was able to witness dark signs of his obsession and mental disorder. Each object carefully kept as a shrine to her deceased mother revealed a haunting duality between love and possession, affection and distorted control. The fine line between victim and villain in Norman's story became increasingly blurred as the protagonist delved deeper into his fractured psyche. She questioned the extent to which Norman was a product of his circumstances, a man tormented by inner demons and external manipulations, versus a villain whose choices led him into the abyss of horror. Norman Bates' story served not only as a case study in the nature of evil, but also as a grim reminder of the dangers of ignoring the emotional scars that can lead to devastating consequences. The protagonist found herself debating these questions as she tried to reconcile the trauma he inflicted with the compassion her story evoked. The protagonist left the Bates Motel with a mixed feeling of relief and uneasiness. As the police cars drove away, carrying Norman Bates away, a superficial sense of calm set in. However, as she looked back one last time, a shadow passed by Norman's bedroom window, a quick, fleeting movement that made her shudder. That last suggestive scene left her feeling that the horrors of the Bates Motel were not completely over. Norman's macabre presence and the dark mysteries that permeated that isolated place still echoed in his mind, as if evil had left an indelible mark on that place. She took a deep breath, trying to push away the disturbing thoughts as she headed towards the waiting car. Despite everything, the protagonist knew that the nightmare would not end there. The Bates Motel had become a place of painful memories and buried fears, a grim testament to the fragility of the human mind and the dark secrets that can lurk behind seemingly normal facades. As the car drove away down the road, the young woman looked out the window one last time at the motel disappearing in the rearview mirror. A cold night breeze whispered through the surrounding empty fields, as if the place itself held secrets that would never be fully revealed. And so ends the story of Bates Motel, a place where hidden horrors revealed the fragility of the human mind. If you're intrigued by the dark mysteries of Norman Bates and the disturbing secrets of the isolated motel, be sure to leave your comment below. Subscribe to our channel for more exciting and scary content like this, and don't forget to share with your friends to spread the suspense. See you next time, where we'll explore more mysteries and psychological horror together.